So hi everyone, my name is Sofía and I am one of the ESRs that was working within the MultiMind project. And today I want to talk to you a bit about the research that I conducted as part of the MultiMind project, which is also what is going to be included in part of my PhD. And the title of the talk is Relationships between Bilingualism and Social Biases, the role of executive control and motivation to respond without prejudice. Before, Theo was mentioning stereotypes, but since I am going to talk about stereotypes and prejudice, I decided to propose a more general title and focus on social biases. So don't worry if some of you don't know what social biases are and are completely unfamiliar with this, because I'm going to try to walk you through all the most important concepts and then show you some bits of the studies that I conducted with my collaborators and the results that we found. So our plan for today is first to have a very, very general overview of some studies that have looked into the processing of social information, so including social biases, social categorization, etc., in bilingual. So what do we know so far? And I can tell you that we just know a tiny bit of this. And then I want to talk about 3 studies. So 2 have been conducted and 1 is currently ongoing, but I want to give you some sneak peek at what we are doing. And first I will present the first study that we conducted about bilingualism and the expression of social biases. Don't worry if you don't understand some terms, we will walk together through them. And I will make a short stop to present some findings from a study that is not related to social biases, but it is related to bilingualism. And I thought that it might be interesting for some of you if you are interested in analyzing some comparisons between bilinguals and monolinguals, for example. Then I'm going to present a second study in which we focus on the potential influences of specific language experiences in the expression of explicit bias among bilinguals. And then just some introduction to a new study that we are conducting I am very excited about. So I also want to share some information with you. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to bring your attention to is to all of us to do an exercise and to think about, okay, so when we think about the studies on bilingualism, what is the first thing that comes to our minds? In my case, for example, is executive control. It is language learning. It is language acquisition, language development, et cetera, et cetera. And we can find several studies that explore the relationships between bilingualism, bilinguals versus monolinguals, language experiences, being raised in a bilingual home, et cetera, et cetera. And we can find several studies on this topic. However, there is little yet done on the potential connections between bilingualism and the processing of social information, despite having a strong relevance in our communication. So there are not many things done, but there are a few studies, and I wanted to just mention a bit about some of the general topics that have been analyzed. So we can have a lot of studies, quite a few studies, on perspective taking, and theory of mind, especially in children. Perspective taking is the ability that we have to understand a situation from a different point of view, whereas theory of mind refers more to the capacity to understand that what we know, what we feel, our intentions, etc., might be different from those of other people. And we have quite a few studies on this, especially in children. We have also some studies on social categorization. I will present one today. So social categorization is the process of grouping individuals based on some common characteristics. So for example, grouping individuals based on their sex, male versus female, on their age, old versus young, et cetera, et cetera. And we have some stuff on this. We have also one study that I wanted to bring up today that taps into something that it's called social flexibility. And it's about the ability to switch and to adapt to different social environments. So again, we are talking about some kind of like social information processing, so the ability to adapt to different environments, the ability to read the social cues in our environment, very important, especially when we're using more than one language on a daily basis, right? You need to understand the environment. And then, of course, we have some stuff on social biases. And so social biases are the beliefs, but also the opinions that we have about members of different groups. So when we talk about beliefs, we usually refer to stereotypes. And when we talk about opinions, we are referring to prejudice. And these opinions tend to be negative. In general, social biases can be divided in two types of biases that are very related to the measures that we use to assess them. So we usually differentiate between explicit bias and implicit bias. Maybe just by the title, you already have a sense of what explicit and implicit means. So explicit bias refers to the conscious opinions and beliefs. Remember this distinction, stereotypes, prejudice. So the conscious opinions and beliefs that we have about members from other groups. Whereas the implicit bias focuses more on the automatic accessibility to stereotypical knowledge. So we might not be so aware of our implicit biases, but they are there. However, the explicit bias, when we express them, we are conscious of this expression. Explicit bias is usually assessed using questionnaires. And I have here one item from one questionnaire that we actually use in one of our studies, or in all of our studies. And this exemplary item says, it is more important for a wife to help her husband's career than to have one herself. So as you can see, this is an opinion, and it is conscious. So the person reads this statement and indicates whether they agree, more or less, etc. On the other hand, the implicit bias is usually measured using experimental tasks, so that we can test in the laboratory. And I have here one screenshot. Yes, from one study, it's quite old, but very famous on implicit bias. And this is called the weapon identification task. Maybe you already have a sense of what type of bias this task is measuring. Yes, exactly. So we have some race bias here. And the idea what the participants have to do is simply indicate whether this image is a tool or is a gun. And what happens is that the experimenters manipulate the prime that they see, so a picture that is displayed right before the tool or the gun, and it's either a black face or a white face. And what the authors observe is that people tend to make more mistakes. They tend to indicate that the target is a gun when they see a black face before compared to when they see a white face. And they also do it faster. So this is one of the tasks that is typically used to measure race implicit bias. Whereas to measure explicit bias, we would use a question. Okay, keeping this into account, now that you have an idea, okay, we have studies on perspective taking, theory of mind, social biases, explicit, implicit bias, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. So now let's have a quick look at some of these studies and what they have found. So you can understand more or less where we are. So when it comes to perspective taking and theory of mind, as I said, most of the studies on bilingualism focus on children. And we have, for example, some studies showing better perspective taking abilities in bilingual children compared to monolingual children. And this is typically measured perspective taking children using the 3-mountain task, which is represented here. Here we have a girl and a doll. And what is going to happen is that the researcher will move the doll around the mountains, and the girl will have to choose pictures that represent the point of view of the doll. And the idea is that based on some previous studies, it seems that bilingual children might have better abilities in doing so. This can also be done using non-physical doll and non-physical mountains, but it's still like we have also computerized versions of perspective taking tasks, such as this one. So the child needs to indicate which of the 4 pictures represent the point of view of the owl. Maybe you can do it yourself. Okay, and we also have some studies showing that bilingual children seem to develop their theory of mind slightly earlier compared to monolingual children. And this is also typically measured using the Sally Ann task. Maybe you are also familiar with it. So we have a story about 2 friends, 2 dolls usually, let's say 2 friends. This is Sally and this is Anne. So Sally has a marble and she puts the marble in her basket and then goes for a walk. She spends some time outside enjoying the nature, and her friend Anne, in the meantime, enters the room, takes Sally's marble and hides her in her basket. Sally, after her walk, comes back looking for her marble. And the question is, where is Sally gonna look for the marble? In her own basket or in Anne's box? And this is the task that is typically used in children, one of them, to measure theory of mind. So we can see that it seems that in children, bilinguals tend to develop perspective taking abilities, theory of mind, etc., slightly earlier than monolinguals. And we have some similar results also in adult population. Oops. Sorry. Yes. And so it seems that these results kind of like replicate in adults as well. And they also depend on the specific language experiences. So it seems that based on this study by Navarro and collaborators, regularly using a second language, switching between languages, having experience like multiple languages during childhood has also an impact on how bilinguals process or perform in theory of mind tasks. Okay. Very quickly, when it comes to social categorization and social flexibility, we have some studies showing that bilinguals are slightly better at categorizing social information and recategorizing. So when they do a switching task, such as this one, we have a picture of a man, a woman, another woman. They have to do either gender categorization. So is this a man or a woman? Age categorization, is this person old or young? And they are switching between the two categorization rules. What research has shown is that it seems that bilinguals have it slightly easier to perform this task. And then, as I mentioned before, one study actually analyzed the social flexibility concept, the ability to switch between social environments, to adapt to different environments, to read social cues. And they showed, this was a questionnaire-based study, and the results shows that bilinguals seem to have greater social flexibility as they reported in their questionnaire response. Okay, what do we know now? Just last point in terms of previous studies, and then we will jump to the studies that we conducted specifically. What do we know on social biases? So what I can tell you is that the studies that are available at the moment published are in children. And we have studies both with infants and with toddlers. All the studies come from the same research group. And one of the studies, the study in infants, sorry, they compare bilingual and monolingual children who were exposed to one language, the monolinguals, or two languages, the bilinguals were exposed to English and Chinese. And they perform a task like this one. So this is from their article. So they showed the babies faces of people that were looking at the baby and say, hey, baby, look here. And they were looking to one of these 4 boxes. There were some faces that were, so the faces were looking at the boxes, and after a while, like a toy Elmo, for example, was being displayed on the screen, was dancing. So some of the faces were always looking at the correct location, for example, here. And there were other faces that sometimes were looking at the correct location and sometimes were not. And they found some differences between the bilingual and the monolingual infants, so that when the faces were not very reliable, so when they were looking sometimes yes and sometimes no, the bilingual babies were just ignoring them. However, the monolinguals, when the face was from their own race, were still like looking at them and looking at the location where the face was looking for. So they were following the gaze. This is one study based on language exposure in bilingual and monolingual infants. And we have another study on toddlers where they found some differences between the English Mandarin bilinguals and 2 groups of monolinguals, one that was English monolinguals from Singapore and Mandarin monolinguals from Singapore. And they found differences in implicit bias and explicit bias. If you remember, this implicit is more automatic processing, whereas explicit is more declarative. Of course, they did not ask the children to fill out a questionnaire because they were between 3 and 4 years old. But they use a slightly different approach. So they show pictures of a doctor, a chef, and a policeman, if I remember correctly. And they manipulated the race, the face of the policeman, of the doctor and chef. And the children had to choose the doctor for themselves, the policeman for themselves. And they consider this as a measure of explicit bias. They also conducted another study only with bilinguals, where they were trying to explore some individual differences that might be related to their explicit and implicit bias, also with young children. And they found that cognitive flexibility was important, so executive control is important, and that also the parental education was important. But as I said, what we can see here is that, okay, so there seems to be a connection between bilingualism and social biases, explicit bias, implicit bias, but we only know things about children. So what about adults? And this is where we enter the stage. So I'm going to talk about our first study, tell you very briefly a bit more about some previous research that has guided us into running this study and has helped us to develop the model that we tested, and show you the results, of course. So when we were developing this study, we started by thinking that, okay, so we live in very complex societies that differ in the languages. So we have multiple languages, we have multiple sexualities, religions, family structures, etc. Some previous studies have shown that this complexity can actually enhance the use of social biases, especially among those individuals who have more difficulties to tolerate ambiguity and diversity. However, other studies have also shown that having a flexible mindset can actually help to handle this complexity. And we were thinking, okay, so we have some past evidence on the connections between bilingualism, cognitive flexibility, executive control. Maybe there is something here going on. And we started to explore the literature. We found that there were actually some connections between bilingualism and social biases as well, as I showed on the previous studies. We also have some, as I said, some connections between this flexibility, the ability to handle complexity, and also some studies that have shown a link between executive control abilities and the expression of social biases, so that having greater executive control abilities is linked to the expression of social biases. And we have previous studies that have linked bilingualism with greater executive control efficiency. So we thought, okay, so maybe there is a connection between bilingualism and social biases in adults, as has been observed in children. Maybe executive control is our underlying mechanism that kind of like explain this connection. So we started to keep these things into account for our study. And we also considered something else that was very relevant and that can play an important role, on the expression of social biases. And this is motivation, and more specifically, the motivation to respond without prejudice. So previous studies and research has shown that the expression of social biases is influenced by our motivation to respond without prejudice. And this is very important. There are different sources of motivation, and there are two usually considered: implicit and explicit motivation, internal and external motivation. So we have some studies showing that motivation matters, and more importantly, that motivation will impact the connection between executive control and social biases. So what is internal and external motivation? This is important to understand the results from the study that I'm going to show you in a moment. So internal motivation is the motivation that is driven by our personal reasons. One example from a questionnaire that I have here that measures internal motivation says, I attempt to act in non-prejudiced ways toward Black people because it is personally important to me. So you can get a glimpse of what internal motivation measures. And then we have external motivation, which is a motivation driven by our social norms, by the society that we live in. So for example, we don't want to express prejudice because we know that our friends are going to be angry at us. One item from the questionnaire that is typically used to measure motivation says, I try to act non-prejudiced toward Black people because of pressure from others. So you can see we have, okay, this is important to me, internal motivation, or I am worried about what others are going to think of me, so external motivation. They are independent sources of motivation. So we can have high internal and low external, high internal and high external, and so on and so forth. They can be measured together, but there can also be analyzed separately, which is what we do in our study. And overall, the idea that I want to keep you in terms of relevant research that is going to be important for the results I'm going to show you today is that in general, having high internal motivation is good and is related to reduce social biases, whereas having high external motivation is not that good, but it is related to increased social biases. So when we are very worried about what others might think of us, we might actually end up expressing more social biases. And some authors said that this is because of the conflict that you are experiencing during this process. So going back to the study that I want to talk today. So we know that executive control is important, motivation is important. There are some connections between bilingualism and stereotype control. And social biases. Here I have a stereotype expression, but I want to refer to explicit biases and social biases in general. And what some studies have shown is, as I said before, that motivation seems to modulate the impact of executive control. And it looks like individuals who benefit more from their executive control are those who have more difficulties actually controlling their expression of social biases. So we had a knowledge of all of this, and we were wondering, okay, so are bilingual adults less likely to express social biases compared to monolinguals? And if this is the case, why is this happening? Is it because they have better executive control abilities? And what about motivation? Will motivation play a role in this connection? Maybe bilinguals are more internally motivated to express less social biases and so on. So we had this research question. And following the previous studies, we pre-registered the model that I just described to you, and we established the following hypothesis. So we hypothesized that yes, there is going to be a relationship between bilingualism and social biases. This relationship is going to be mediated by executive control. So this will be like the underlying mechanism that explains the connection. But at the same time, it's also going to be modulated by motivation to respond without prejudice, because it is very important in the expression of social biases, right? So probably we can have fantastic executive control abilities, but if we are not motivated to actually try and control our expression of prejudice, maybe this will not work. So we hypothesize that there are going to be role of executive control and of motivation. And we conducted an online study using questionnaires. We conducted this study in 2020, so it was during COVID. And we tested bilinguals and monolinguals from the United Kingdom. We tested 1,372 participants. And you can see here that we have a lot of monolinguals. You will understand very quickly why. So we use a platform called Prolific that it has a huge database of participants. And we implemented a few filters. So we said, okay, so for monolinguals, we want them born and living in the UK. We want them to know only English, to be raised monolingually. And bilinguals, we want participants that are from all around the world, but that are living in the UK and know more than one language. So we focus on the UK because we were trying to find monolinguals with little foreign language experiences. And based on reports from the European Commission, it seems that the United Kingdom might have a higher ratio of these monolinguals. But at the same time, we were aware of the problems that we face when we try to compare bilinguals and monolinguals. So who are the bilinguals? What does bilingualism mean? What is the definition of bilingual? Can we be sure that our monolinguals have no experiences with foreign languages just because they said that they know only English? So yes, based on one item. So we were not so sure about this. And we conducted a pre-screening study, a pre-screening survey. And I'm going to very, very briefly make a short impasse here on the presentation to tell you what we found, because maybe some of you are interested in conducting some research comparing bilinguals and monolinguals. So we invited all these 970 monolinguals to complete a very, very short survey where we ask you about their experiences learning languages. Have you ever learned our language outside school? Their experiences living in non-English speaking countries, for example, maybe they went on an Erasmus. So we wanted to know that. And their experiences in the UK being exposed to other languages. And so we thought that, okay, maybe we will find some participants that learn foreign languages, but probably just a few of them. Maybe we will find participants who live abroad, probably just a few of them. But still, we were very interested in understanding exactly what are the linguistic experiences of these participants in order to be able to better compare them with the bilinguals. And we were very surprised by the results. I can tell you that more than 80% of them actually learned foreign languages or dialects or type of jargon. So we were very open here. And it's not only that more than 80% learn foreign languages, but out of all of these who learn foreign languages, more than half actually use them. So they confirm using them. We found that more than 50%, so 60% were exposed to foreign languages at some point in their lives in the United Kingdom. And among those who were exposed to, a huge number of participants confirmed that they actually use those languages as well at some point. And we found that just a small amount of participants lived in non-English speaking countries or spent some time. The minimum was 1 month. But from those who were abroad, actually a lot of them used foreign languages. And this was very important because it helped us to actually select participants with little experiences with foreign languages. So to select monolinguals who only learn like up to 2 languages for up to 7 years, who lived abroad no more than 6 months, who never used foreign languages as per declarations. And from the 970, we kept 415. And we kept 397 bilinguals. Of course, some of them had some bilingual problems with the questionnaire, they had to be filtered and so on. So all these people were invited and completed a battery of questionnaires on self-reported executive control, on explicit bias. Remember, these are the opinions, right? The beliefs that we explicitly mention on the questionnaires, on motivation. And we also asked them to complete some exploratory questionnaire to know more about their multicultural experience, and bilinguals completed some questionnaires on their language experience. Sorry, give me a second. I just want to make a short note here, because I have highlighted that our executive control was measured using self-report measures. So we decided to go with self-report measures because we were, there are some studies that have shown that actually self-reported measures, so report measures, might be better at when you want to measure individual differences because of the low inter-individual variance. And there are some problems, right, with the executive control tasks that we usually use in the laboratory. So we have problems that sometimes the tasks do not correlate, right? We have the problem of task impurity. So what is exactly this task measuring? Executive control, it's formed by very different processes, right? So it is complicated, and we decided to start by using these self-report measures of executive control. And we focus on explicit bias only. Remember, this is a questionnaire-based study. And we were primarily interested at least in this first step, to understand a bit more about the differences between bilinguals and monolinguals in the application of social biases that are in the form of opinion and beliefs, and not so much in this accessibility of stereotypical knowledge. So this would come in like later stages of this line of research, because this is kind of like, this was the first study that tried to explore all these complex connections in adults. So I have here, I'm not going to go into details with all the questionnaires, but we included 2 questionnaires on executive control, 2 questionnaires on explicit bias. We have this internal and external motivation questionnaire. Remember, internal, personal values, external, social norms. We have 1 questionnaire on the multicultural experience, because previous studies have shown some connections between bilingualism, monolingualism, and bilingualism and multiculturalism, sorry. And we wanted to have a sense of how this was playing in our sample. And then bilinguals also completed some questionnaires on their linguistic experiences. So to analyze our data, we use something called moderated mediation analysis. Maybe some of you are familiar. But basically, this type of analysis allows us to explore 2 pathways. So on the one hand, we can see whether bilingualism is related to differences in explicit bias, whether bilinguals express more or less explicit bias compared to monolinguals, when all the other variables are kept constant, right? So when executive control is kept constant and motivation. And more interestingly, it allows us to explore the indirect effect of bilingualism and explicit biases. So whether bilingualism is related to differences in the expression of explicit biases via bilinguals having greater self-reported executive control. And it also allows us to see whether this connection varies depending on the individual differences in motivation. So depending on whether our participants have high internal motivation, so they are motivated primarily by these personal reasons, or whether they are motivated by social norms, so they have high external motivation. So it allows us to see how the connection between bilingualism and explicit bias, whether it is the mechanism underlying this connection is executive control, and how it is affected by differences in motivation. So very, very briefly, what we found is that we found some connections. So we found something. we observed that there was no direct relationship between bilingualism and our measure of sexism that was called neo-sexism. So this is a questionnaire that measures or that assesses the conflict between the egalitarian values that we have nowadays in terms of gender equality and some negative feelings that still exist toward women. So we observed that it was not directly related, but we did found some differences via cognitive flexibility and internal motivation. So what we observed is that bilingualism was not directly related to differences in neo-sexism, but bilingualism was associated with with higher self-reported cognitive flexibility, which in turn was related to reduced neo-sexism. However, as we hypothesized, this was not everything. So there were some differences also, depending on participants' internal motivation, these personal reasons. And what we observed is that the effects of bilingualism on neo-sexism via cognitive flexibility were significant only when we compared bilinguals and monolinguals who had low and moderate internal motivation and not high. How do we interpret this? For those participants with low and moderate internal motivation, it is harder to control the expression of neo-sexism. So for those participants, cognitive flexibility helps. And here's where we see the difference between bilinguals and monolinguals. And the same results, the same pattern of results was observed with our second measure of explicit bias, which was called group focus enmity. So this is a general measure of biases toward different groups. So we have sexism, we have racism, we have homophobia, we have xenophobia, we have the evaluation of homeless people, etc., etc. So it is a general measure. The other was focusing only on sexism. This one is includes items on different groups. And we observed the same pattern of results. Bilingualism was not directly related to differences in group focus enmity, but again, bilingualism was linked to more efficient cognitive flexibility, which was associated with a reduced expression of group focus enmity, but only among participants with low internal motivation in this case, no moderate and no high. So this shows that, okay, motivation is very important and executive control seems to be our underlying mechanism explaining the connections between bilingualism and explicit bias. There was something going on in the back of our heads, because if you remember, we had this questionnaire on multicultural experience. We have previous studies that have shown links between multicultural experience and explicit bias and social biases in general. And we said, okay, so this is fantastic. We found some connections, but is it really bilingualism? What if it's multicultural experience? And actually, this might not be so far from maybe being the response, because we had a look at the distribution of our multicultural experience between participants. And you can see here that bilinguals is red, monolinguals is blue. The majority of monolinguals had reported low multicultural experience, whereas quite a lot of bilinguals reported high multicultural experience. And if you look at the means, so we have 272 for bilinguals, 0.56 for monolinguals. So, okay, maybe we could actually draw a line here and do the same analysis with multicultural experience as our predictor, right? What if bilingualism is not actually bilingualism? What is explaining the results, but it's multicultural experience? So what we did is that in order to explore this possibility, we repeated all the analysis and we controlled for multicultural experience. So we made constant multicultural experience about in our two groups. And what we found is that multicultural experience was not behind the bilingualism effects, but it did play a role on group focus enmity. Group focus enmity was this questionnaire or this measure of stereotypes of many different kinds and prejudice of many different kinds, sexism, racism, and so on. So it seems that this measure might be more influenced by multicultural experience, but when it comes to sexism, multicultural experience was not relevant at all. So what does this, in general, what can we conclude from this first study? So the first thing is that, okay, there is a connection between bilingualism and the expression of explicit bias, our conscious beliefs and opinions. And this seems to be mediated, so our mechanism is cognitive flexibility. However, the relationship is subsequently modulated by individual differences in motivation to respond without prejudice, and specifically internal motivation. This is very important. So yes, cognitive flexibility explains the connection, but don't forget about motivation. And we also conclude that the association between bilingualism and explicit bias, it is not solely explained by bilinguals having more multicultural experiences than monolinguals or reporting more multicultural experiences than monolinguals, but multicultural experience also matters. So this is also something important to take into account for future studies. Okay, we are done with our first study. I want to show you now very briefly a second study that we conducted, also based on this data set. And just as an introduction, maybe you forgot already, but I hope not. So when I was presenting the measures that we included in this study, so I said, yeah, we have self-reported executive control, we have explicit bias, we have motivation, we have multicultural experience, we have language experiences for bilinguals, but I never came back to this. It's not that we ignored the language experiences, but we actually use them in this second study. So we conducted a second study that was basically a reanalysis of all the data that we had collected in our first study. And the goal of this study was to actually see whether there are some connections between different bilingual language experiences and the expression of explicit bias. So on the first study, we did kind of like, we introduced the topic and we compare monolinguals and bilinguals. We see some differences. Okay, now we want to have a more fine-grained look at our bilingual sample and see whether differences in their experiences, past and present experiences with foreign languages, actually play a role in the degree of explicit bias that they express. So we wanted to know which dimensions of the bilingual experience drive the relationships between bilingualism and the expression of explicit bias. So we took all our participants, we excluded the monolinguals, and we analyzed the data of 389 bilinguals with all the questionnaires that I presented before, plus taking into account the questionnaires on language experience. And the analytical approach that we follow comprised two steps. So this was a completely exploratory study. So we did not establish any a priori hypotheses or predictions. And we had a lot of data. So the first step that we wanted to take was, okay, let's stop for a moment and let's try to reduce all the multidimensionality that we have in this data using principal component analysis. Let's try to understand a bit better what are the relationships between our linguistic variables, what are the relationships between our measures of executive control, the relationships between our motivation questionnaires, and we conducted two principal component analyses. The first one, we call it linguistic principal component analysis. We wanted to explore the linguistic variables and multicultural experience because we know this is related. We wanted to see like what are the relationships between them and whether we can group them into some dimensions that kind of like explain the general experiences of our bilinguals. And then we did the same with the self-reported executive control, with motivation, and also with some of the social-demographic variables, because previous studies have shown that there are some differences depending, for example, on socioeconomic status of participants, age of participants. We also had more women than men in our study, slightly more. So we wanted to take some of these aspects into account. We took some of the demographics and include them into another social-demographic, social-cognitive principal component analysis. This was our first step, understand the relationships. And then we said, okay, so now that we have kind of like established some connections between the variables, we have reduced the multidimensionality, we have some constructs, let's say, that represent our bilingual experience, our executive control, our motivation. So let's see how these different dimensions are related to differences in explicit bias in bilinguals. And we did some linear regressions with the components that we structured here to predict explicit bias. So slowly, let's walk together. When we were trying to reduce the multidimensionality of the data, we took a lot of linguistic variables and multicultural experience. So we had language use entropy, which is the diversity in the language use of participants on a daily basis. We had switching frequency, we have mixing frequency, we have the dominance in passive use. So passive use is the use of languages when we read or listen. Dominance in active use, when we speak, when we write. So is there one language more predominant than others? How much? And we also calculated two indices. This is something quite novel. So we wanted to focus on this diversity. We had the diversity in language use, indexed by language entropy. We also wanted to have a look at the diversity in terms of the past experience during their language learning trajectory. So we conducted an index of proficiency entropy, which basically shows that like higher proficiency entropy, higher diversity in the proficiency of our participants, and also bilingualism onset entropy, so higher diversity in the age of acquisition of the different languages. And we had multicultural experience again. So we were very interested in seeing like whether all these variables kind of like build into two dimensions that represent the bilingual experience of our participants, and whether multicultural experience have a place in some of these dimensions. And we actually found two components. So we had one component that kind of like measures the diversity in language use. So higher scores means higher diversity in language use, means higher switching frequency, higher mixing frequency. And we noticed that multicultural experience also loaded into this component. So it seems that using more language frequently, switching between them, having a low dominance in the passive use, having a low dominance in the active use is related to differences in multicultural experience. And then we also had a second component. We can call it language background diversity. We can also call it language learning diversity in terms of journey. And we have here our proficiency. So more diversity in proficiency, more diversity in age of acquisition loaded into this second component. And we did the same with our socio-cognitive variables that we call. So we have remember, self-reported executive control, motivation, socio-demographic characteristics. And we included the scores from our executive control questionnaires, our internal and reverse external motivation. I will tell you a bit more about this in a moment. And some characteristics of our participants, as well as of the maternal and paternal education. So why do I have here reverse external motivations? I'm not going to, into details of all like the computations that we did, but when you run this type of analysis, they're based on correlations between variables. And in our sample, internal motivation correlated negatively with external motivation. What does this mean? So that when we observe higher values in internal motivation, so higher motivation due to personal reasons was associated with a reduced motivation driven by social norms. So in order to facilitate the interpretation of the results that I'm going to show you, we decided to reverse the score of external motivation. So we have here 4 components. This analysis, we took all our variables, put them into our principal component blender, and extracted a component of executive control, a component of motivation, component of parental education, and a component that we call socioeconomic status, but it also includes the income of participants, the education, and the age. So I want to stop for a second and go back to our motivation, because this is a component that might be slightly more complicated. So what I want you to remember here for the component motivation is that when we have higher scores in this component, what it shows is that an individual is primarily motivated by internal reasons. Remember that they were negatively correlated before, right? So if we have high scores here, motivated by internal reasons. If we have low scores, it shows that the participant is motivated primarily by social norms, by this external motivation, right? So as I mentioned before, internal motivation and being motivated primarily by internal reasons, by personal reasons, is associated with reduced expression of social biases, whereas being motivated primarily by social norms, by external motivation, is associated with the expression of more biases. So when we have this component, we would expect that higher scores in this component would be associated with reduced bias, because we have internal motivation, personal reasons here being our source of motivation. So going back to our research question, if you remember, we wanted to know which dimensions of language experience, or to what extent different dimensions of language experience are related to differences in the expression of social biases and specifically explicit biases. Questionnaires. So we took our two measures of explicit bias that we had before. We had neo-sexism, we had group focus enmity. Remember, neo-sexism is a measure of sexism. Group focus enmity includes a variety of stereotypes and prejudice about different groups. And we conducted linear regression. And as predictors, we included these components that we created on the previous step. So instead of including every single questionnaire, every single measure, and running several linear regressions, we grouped those variables that shared common variants and that represented different constructs. So we included language use diversity, higher scores, more diversity in language use, language background diversity. Higher scores means or shows higher diversity in proficiency in age of acquisition. And we included self-reported executive control, motivation. Remember, higher scores in the motivation, we are motivated primarily by internal reasons, by personal reasons. Low scores, we are motivated by external social norms. We included our component parental education, our component socioeconomic status, age. And at the same time, following the results from our previous study, we observed some connections between bilingualism and executive control, some connections between motivation, and motivation is very important in explicit bias, right? And implicit bias. So we also explore some interactions between the linguistic components and motivation and between the linguistic components and executive control. So all of this is very complicated. The results are not so complicated. We observed, first of all, that motivation matters once again. So being motivated primarily by internal reasons was associated with reduced explicit biases, lower scores in neo-sexism, lower scores in group focus enmity. And we found some interactions between motivation and language use diversity and motivation and language background diversity. So in order to understand exactly what was going on, what these interactions mean, we decided to take all of our participants and group them based on their language use diversity and their language background diversity. And we did a division in 3 groups for language use, language background. We have around 130 per group. And we said, okay, so let's compare the extremes. So let's repeat the analysis and let's have participants with very low language use diversity and participants with very high language background diversity. Language use diversity. Let's have participants with very low language background diversity and participants with very high language background diversity. And let's see how this plays out with motivation and how it affects our, how it's related better to differences in bias. What did we find? Language use diversity, remember, higher scores, higher language switching, higher language mixing, less dominance of one language over another, more use of different languages on a daily basis, more multicultural experiences on a daily basis. And we observed that there was some interaction with our variable of neo-sexism and motivation. And this might be a bit complex. So we have here motivation. So here we have higher scores in motivation, motivated by internal reasons, by personal reasons. And low scores means primarily motivated by external reasons. And here we have 2 lines. So the dark green shows those participants with more or higher language use diversity, and light green with low language use diversity. So the interpretation that we have here is that it seems that for those participants who are coming from a high language use diversity, this one, motivation is not so relevant in the expression of explicit bias. So there might have some other mechanisms to kind of like help them to express fewer explicit bias. However, having high diverse background in terms of language use actually shows slightly different effects. So what we have here is the same. So we have motivation. We have a different variable here where we found the interaction. So here is group focus enmity. And what we notice here is that it seems that for those participants who have a high language background diversity, the effects of motivation are actually kind of like helping more. So it had like an additive effect. So we are still trying to kind of like make sense of absolutely everything that is going on here. So these are some preliminary analyses that we have conducted recently. But what we can see here, what we kind of like try to interpret here is that it seems that those that use languages, currently use languages a lot, switch a lot, have multicultural experiences, and so on and so forth. Motivation is important, but not so important. But those that don't use languages so often, don't switch so often, don't have multicultural experiences, multicultural motivation is more relevant. When it comes to language background, what might be happening here, but of course we need more analysis, we need more research to try to understand a bit better what is going on. Maybe these participants that come from a diverse language background have actually some kind of like predisposition toward expressing fewer biases, and then motivation kind of like adds a second layer and helps in the reduction overall of bias. But so bottom line, if you remember our question, we wanted to know whether some differences in linguistic experiences, language use, language switching, mixing, multicultural experiences as well, whether this was related to some variations in the expression of explicit bias, so to go one step further and from the comparison between monolinguals and bilinguals to a more fine-grained analysis of our bilingual participants. And we actually found some interesting results. So it shows overall what I want you to remember from here is that it seems that language experience matters, and it modulates the influence or the connections between motivation to respond without prejudice and explicit bias. Of course, what we did here was a reanalysis of an existing data. We've decided to follow this approach of reducing the multidimensionality of the data. There might be some other connections going on. We need more studies, but this shows that we must also take linguistic experiences into account. So comparing bilinguals and monolinguals, this shows some differences. It is important. It adds value to the research. Let's take executive control into account. Let's take motivation into account, multicultural experience into account, but also let's try to go one step further and also pay attention to the qualitative differences that might exist in our bilingual participants. So far here, I have presented two studies for which we have collected data analyzed. So the first one is under review currently, and this second study is in preparation. But we have something else in the kitchen that is being cooked. And I wanted to very, very briefly introduce you and tell you a bit of what we are doing at the moment. So in a study 1 and 2, everything was based on questionnaires. We had self-report measures of executive control for the reasons I mentioned. We had explicit bias because we wanted to know more about opinions, about beliefs, and also because this allows us to collect a large number of data from a lot of participants and kind of like start sensing the relationships that exist between our variables, between bilingualism, explicit bias, and so on. But there are many other things that we want to do, and there are next steps that should be done, right? So these two studies represent, yes, it's the first studies exploring relationships between bilingualism, social biases in adults, show the importance of cognitive mechanisms, motivational mechanisms, linguistic mechanisms. Again, highlight the importance of an holistic approach, right? So this is everything that we can take from our first two studies. And now, to move forward, what are we doing at the moment right now as we speak? So we are running a third study on the same topic, and we want to replicate what we have in study 1 and 2. So we have, again, an online study with questionnaires, but we're adding more things because we also want to see, okay, so we found some relationships with explicit bias, questionnaire. We found some connections via self-reported executive control, but we want to extend this first to more general social categorization processes. So remember social categorization, categorizing individuals based, for example, on their age or their gender. And we want to do this using experimental measures on top of our questionnaires of explicit bias. And of course, we want to also include some experimental measures of executive control, especially because the connections between bilingualism and executive control have been observed using experimental measures, although not always. And this is for another MultiMind talk. but it is important to also take into account some of the experimental measures that exist of executive control. So in this new study, we have, again, questionnaires, the same as we include on the others, and we are including 2 experimental measures of executive control. So we have a voluntary switching task, in which participants choose in some of the trials which task they want to perform. And we have the anti-VEA, which is a flanker task that measures also orienting abilities, alerting abilities, vigilance, etc. And we also include some experimental measures of social categorization. So we have this task called social category switching task that include this stimuli that we developed. So in this task, participants see, so this is a variation of a task that already exists. We just created new stimuli, and participants have to categorize pictures either based on their gender, so is this a man or a woman, or based on whether the role is stereotypically masculine or feminine. So the idea is that when we see an incongruent gender role, it is harder for participants to perform. And this, we have tested it on like quite a few pilot studies, and now we are using it to explore the differences between bilinguals and monolinguals. And we also have something called a trust game. So instead of focusing on these, let's say, more typical categorization rules, such as gender, so we want to also explore whether people trust more male or female, men or women, and whether, depending on some experimental manipulations that they do, whether people are able to learn which group is more cooperative, or whether men or women on our experiment are going to cooperate with them a bit more in terms of giving and exchanging money. And yes, so whether they are going to show some abilities to categorize people not only based on their sex or on the role that they are representing, but also on possibility or the trustworthiness, let's say. We're including these measures, and we are running another online study, again, using the same platform. We have pre-registered our hypothesis and our analysis plan, and we aim at testing around 600 participants. So when I prepared this presentation, we had around 270 tested. I think today we probably have already 300, so we are halfway. And we hope that this will add up, a next step to all this line of research that we have developed on social biases in bilingualism, in bilingual adults and monolingual adults. And well, of course, so before wrapping up, everything that I told you today, I didn't do it on my own, and it would have been impossible for me to do if I did not have the help from my collaborators, and I want to thank them all. So I want to thank my supervisor, Sofia Castro, my co-supervisor, Marcin Bukowski, which have been with me from the start. I also want to thank Juan from the University of Granada, which is also part of the MultiMind project. We are all together. And then there have been other faces that have collaborated at different points in this project as well. So we have Kalinka and Patricia, Kalinka from Warszawa University, Patricia from our lab in Jagiellonian Langusta lab. We have also received a lot of help from Sole, especially in developing our stimuli for this new study. And of course, I want to thank all the members from Langusta for bearing with me for the last few years and helping me to make this project work and to be able to be today here showing you what we found. Thank you very much for spending this hour with me, and I am more than happy to answer questions, discussion, and wherever that you want to share with me now.